down. Is that okay with you, Dr. Simon?
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right, so Town and Gown is sponsored by Age Alive, a program in the College of Osteopathic Medicine dedicated to aging with vitality, East Lansing Primetime Center, and the Social Science Scholars Program. With us today, we have Dr. Amy Simon, who is presenting on empathy in Holocaust studies. Dr. Simon completed her PhD at Indiana University in 2015 and was the recipient of a Saul Kagan Claims Conference Fellowship, as well as the Leon Milman Memorial Fellowship at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. She's the William and Audrey Farber Family Endowed Chair of Holocaust Studies in European Jewish History at Michigan State University, participating in the Department of History, James Madison College, and Jewish Studies. Her research examines victim representations of perpetrators in Yiddish diaries written in the Warsaw, Lodz, and Vilna ghettos during World War II. She believes in a holistic and interdisciplinary approach to history that incorporates a variety of areas, including history, film, literature, public history, and testimony. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Simon.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation. I was really pleased to hear from you. Stella was a student in my Holocaust history class, but during COVID. So it was nice to know that I made an impact and made a connection, even though we were asynchronous online at that time, and definitely a less than ideal teaching situation. But I'm really glad to be here. So yes, today I'm going to talk about empathy in Holocaust studies. So I am a scholar of the Holocaust, very much a historian, looking at contemporary sources written during the Holocaust to try to understand about the victims' experiences. And so that's really where my discussion and interest in empathy came from, in terms of trying to understand not just what happened, right? Why did the Holocaust happen? How did it happen? But really, what did it feel like when it happened? And so I'm going to talk about kind of my process of coming to that thought process. It's not typical in Holocaust studies or in history in general. It's not a typical way to look at things to say, how did they feel? It's more what happened and how did it happen? Why did it happen? What did it mean? And so I'll talk about my kind of unique take on it, the different methodologies I've used, because there are just a few people that have kind of talked about this, and I'm excited to share kind of two things. First of all, that my book is actually coming out June 16th, which I'll talk about in a second, and that's kind of what I'm going to focus on, thinking about how I use empathy in my research. But I also use empathy in my teaching, very specifically. In the last year, I've kind of realized sometimes it takes you a while to even realize who you are and what you're doing. I think that I was always using empathy and it was coming across because Stella contacted me. So I know that she, experienced something of the way that I was both researching using empathy, but also using empathy in the classroom. But now I've made it really clear in my teaching with an empathy statement. We talk about empathy at the start of the semester and how important it is both to what we're studying in terms of, victim groups, but also in terms of each other, right? And of course, it keeps coming up. It came up, so dramatically during COVID and figuring out how to deal with the complicated situations. And obviously with the shooting at MSU last month, it's really relevant again. And so I'm glad that foundation has been laid in my classes, and I will continue doing that. So if you have questions about how I teach with empathy, I'm happy to talk about that as well. But for now, I will share some of my research in Holocaust studies with you. And let me share my screen. Okay, so as I mentioned, I use empathy in the way that I examine historical sources from the Holocaust. And so let me tell you a little bit about what that means. So the book that I have coming out in June is called Emotions in Yiddish Ghetto Diaries, Encountering Persecutors and Questioning Humanity. And so right away in the title, you see a couple things. First of all, that it deals with emotions, which, like I said, is not super typical. Actually, specifically in Holocaust studies, it's not typical at all. I think there's a general idea that once you start looking at emotions, you're kind of separated from an objective viewpoint of history. And I push back against that in my book by using empathy as a method, as a kind of framing method. So I'll talk about that. And then encountering persecutors and questioning humanity. And this is kind of what they did. They were encountering persecutors, and the book looks at how what role emotions play in that encounter. And then what does it lead them to do? It leads them to question humanity. And so we'll see the ways that, again, reading for emotions from an empathetic perspective just creates a different way of thinking about what happened in the ghettos. So the first question that I had when I started my study is, how did people living in the ghettos during the Holocaust perceive their perpetrators? And the reason I chose this is because, again, I've always been interested in specifically the Jewish perspective of the Holocaust. If we think of the Holocaust as an event that primarily was targeted at the Jewish people, that the Jewish people were the one group that Nazi ideology targeted as its most important target group, that this was the one group that they saw as necessary if the Germany that they loved and that was going to be powerful and successful, if that Germany was going to survive, they believed it had to come at the expense of the Jewish people, that there wasn't room enough for the Jews and the Germans. There wasn't I don't even know what I said. Sorry, the Germans and the Jews, that the idea was that this was a fight to the death between Germans and Jews, only one could survive. So that's the center of Nazi ideology. We know that there were other victim groups, of course, during the Holocaust who, were seen as racially inferior or physically inferior, mentally inferior, culturally inferior. There were a lot of ways that people were singled out for persecution, but Jews were this central group that, like I said, was central to the ideology. So I was always interested in Jewish victims. I myself am Jewish. So to me, when I first became interested in Holocaust studies as a teenager, it was very much empathic, that I couldn't imagine myself in that perspective, in that situation, knowing that if I had been alive in Nazi Germany, I would have been killed just for being me. That was something that was very hard for my American, teenager self to understand and to wrap my head around. And that kind of started me on the process of learning more about the Holocaust, and eventually doing a PhD and becoming a scholar of the Holocaust. So empathy was kind of rooted in my interest and in the questions I was asking about victims, right? I was less interested in what did the perpetrators do, and always what did particularly Jewish victims encounter. So how did they perceive their perpetrators? I came to this because surprisingly, in my mind, there's also not something that scholars have ever written about. For the thousands of books that have been written about the Holocaust in the last 80 years, this is one topic that just hasn't come up. And again, I wondered, why hasn't this come up? Why does nobody care about this? Because it seems to me central, right? If we're trying to understand something about how people experienced a historical event, you have to understand all the people involved and how they conceptualized it, how they felt about it, how they thought about it, kind of what it did to them, because there were a lot of perpetrators, right? These were people that lived for years under Nazism, and they encountered, as I'll talk about in a minute, all kinds of people that did all kinds of nasty things to them. And they were people too, right? And so they were having human interactions and reactions to these people. And I thought that's really important. Why has nobody talked about it before? So I decided to be the one to do that. So I started to, I had to figure out how can I get to that, right? How do I know what they thought about their persecutors? And there are really two answers. One is contemporary sources written at the time, and two is memoirs, right? Post-war, either written memoirs or oral testimony. And I really was interested in primary sources from the time, because I realized pretty early on that it was really important for me to be able to trace over time um, how their reactions changed. It became clear that this wasn't like some kind of static situation, that there was some people lived in ghettos for up to 5 years. And so there was a lot of difference in the types of things they experienced over those 5 years. And there were different perpetrators that popped up. Different people did different things during that time. So I knew I wanted to look at contemporary sources as opposed to memoirs or post-war testimonies. And I already had an interest in diaries as historical sources. I had already read a number of Holocaust diaries and was really fascinated by them. And I thought, oh yeah, diaries, that's exactly the way to get in, because it is, the genre that I argue is the closest. There's no source that can ever, capture the reality of any historical event, obviously, because we're not there. We didn't write it. We didn't experience it. There's always going to be a divide. And especially if you think of something like the Holocaust, that, for me is unimaginable. I've never been in a situation like that. I can be empathetic, but I can't fully be empathetic. I can't quite imagine it, as none of us can. And so to me, diaries were kind of the closest way, because they were written very close to the events, right? So it wasn't like people were remembering 2 years later, or, sometimes 50 years later, what happened to them. You got a sense of how they felt along the way, and how they were really reacting in real time. So, and also because diaries are more personal than most other historical sources, it was a way at getting maybe as close as possible to what they really felt, that they were writing in these diaries because of, for various reasons. Some people wrote just to record the history. Some people wrote, like anybody would write a diary, to kind of deal with emotions and kind of work through whatever's going on personally. And other people wrote, as a coping mechanism to maintain their own sense of humanity by having this this compatriot in the diary. And so the diaries often just present more personal, more emotional insights or descriptions than other historical sources. So again, if we're thinking about empathy and bringing to it an idea of trying to understand victims' experiences, diaries made a lot of sense to me. And then the question, of course, is why is it important to even know what they thought or perceived about their perpetrators? And I would argue again that this is about empathy, because if we want to really know, if we really want to put ourselves in that position as well as we can, as well as, again, anybody can in a historical situation, this seemed to me just like an essential part of the human part of the story, right? That the Holocaust didn't happen, as much as it's easy and as much as we and they like to distance the human beings that persecuted them from human, right? Calling them animals and beasts and, the Nazi beast. The reality is, of course, they were people. They were bad people. Sometimes they weren't even bad people. And that's what we'll talk about too, that it was often much more complicated than that. So to me, like the essence of what is human and what can we understand from the Holocaust really has to do with this moment of interaction between victims and perpetrators. And then again, trying to understand the actual experience and the feelings associated with it. I thought that's one. I mean, there are other, but that was one key area to investigate. So I want to say a couple things about the ghettos. So a lot of people, when they think about the Holocaust, they think about Auschwitz, they think about concentration camps, they think about the gas chambers, they think about the crematoria, these really horrific images from the mass murder of Jews on an industrial scale. If we think about the ways that murder was systematized, bureaucratized, to kill as many Jews as possible. Actually, today I was teaching my Holocaust history class just before this, and we watched a film called Conspiracy about the Wannsee Conference, which was a conference held in January of 1942, which kind of laid out the final solution and how many Jews from each country would be killed and how. And so in that, they talk about the gas chambers and the kind of process of being able to murder 2,500 people per hour in the gas chambers. So that's, not surprisingly, the most kind of vivid image and, that people have from the Holocaust, the knowledge that most people have, either that or the Diary of Anne Frank, right? Which so many people, even still today, my students, and I certainly read it in school. It came out in English in 1952. So it was one of the earliest representations of the Holocaust that people in the United States had access to. And the black and white film was either 56 or 59. I'm not remembering exactly, but, also very early after the Holocaust. So those are kind of the two images people have. But as I mentioned, there was this enormous system of ghettos, which served as kind of temporary holding places for Jews before we got to something like Auschwitz and the gas chambers. And so this map here shows you just a very small number of the major ghettos that existed in occupied Europe from 1939 to 44. So that's until the second to last year of the war. So right from the start to the second to last year. And you can see it goes, it's kind of color coded. The yellow were the first ghettos. So when Germany invaded Poland, starting World War II in September of 1939, they immediately started targeting Jews there, again, as part of this policy of like a fight to the death between Jews and non-Jews. They call it radical eliminationist anti-Semitism. So when they entered Poland, Poland had 3 million Jews as well. Germany itself only had 500,000. So this was already kind of a different scale that they felt they had to address. And so the first idea was ghettoization. Round up the Jews, put them together so we can keep tabs on them, so we can keep them away from everybody else, so that we can separate them from the Poles so they won't rise up together, and so that we can figure out what's going to be more of a long-term solution, right? We probably can't keep them in ghettos forever, but maybe we can send them to Madagascar. Maybe we can keep them in one area of the Soviet Union, we'll figure it out. So they started putting Jews in ghettos, which again, just meant bringing them, all the Jews that lived in a certain city together, and concentrating them in small living areas, often in the worst parts of town, sometimes without electricity or running water. And so, for example, in Warsaw, there were 400,000 Jews who all were put into a ghetto that was, a tiny portion of I think it was 30% of the population of the city put in 2% of the area of the city. Łódź was the second largest population with 250,000 Jews, all concentrated into a tiny area. The big ghettos, they had walls around them, they had barbed wire. The smaller ones didn't all have that, but they were all guarded so that Jews couldn't go freely in and out. And so, so we have this series of ghettos created in Poland, and then with the invasion of the Soviet Union, we see a whole bunch more as the Nazi military went east, and all of these places there were another 5 million Jews in the Soviet Union. So these were all places that had large Jewish populations. And then eventually in 1944, when Germany invaded Hungary, or kind of took over Hungary, they created also, this was about 1 million people, Jewish population of about 1 million. And so they put all of the Hungarian Jews in ghettos as well. So this was an ongoing process. And so in these places, Łódź was the longest running ghetto. It was created in 1939, and it was not liquidated until August of 1944. So liquidated means deporting all the Jews to a death killing center. In this case, different ones in the East, many of the Jews didn't go to killing centers, but were just brought outside of town and shot en masse by the tens of thousands. That's what happened Vilna, for example. So this was the area, and these were the people that I was interested in learning more about what their life was like while they were inside these ghettos, again, often for at least 2, sometimes up to 4 years, 4 or 5 years. So what did I find when I went to go look at diaries and figure out how I was going to do this research? I was studying in the Yiddish language. So Yiddish is a language created from German and Hebrew. It was brought to Central Europe or is created in Central Europe around the year 1100. And then when Jews from that part of Germany, actually it was Western Germany, when they were persecuted during the Crusades and several other kind of economic uprising, or not uprisings, but kind of economic problems that were going on in Germany at the time, Jews started immigrating east. They were welcome in the area of Poland, Lithuania, which was one empire at the time. They were treated as, beneficial members of society that would help the economy of Poland, Lithuania. So many Jews went, and so this became the area. They went and they prospered, and they procreated. And so, after many, many generations, we have these very large populations of of Jews in Eastern Europe speaking Yiddish, because they had brought the language with them. There's Slavic involved in the language. There's, like I said, mainly German and Hebrew. There's some Russian involved as well. And so that was my research language. People did write diaries in Polish as well. Jews in the ghettos wrote mainly in Polish. The close second was Yiddish, some in German, some in Russian, some in Hebrew. So those are kind of the main languages. So I wanted to look at Yiddish because it was the language of choice for a lot of intellectuals who were very concerned. They thought Yiddish was the heart of the Jewish people. So people were assimilating, they were learning Polish. They were, participating in Polish society, especially in the 20s and 30s leading up to World War II. But there is a large group of people that felt that in order to maintain one's Jewishness and to kind of forge ahead in creating Jewish, rich Jewish cultural world, Yiddish was the key to that. It was everybody's mother tongue, and that they couldn't lose that to Polish or to other surrounding languages. So I was very interested in using Yiddish because it kind of captures that particular essence that they also were advocating for in the Yiddish language. So what I found in Yiddish is that about 30 to 40 diaries survive from these ghettos that I was looking at. I had decided on Warsaw, Łódź, and Vilna as 3 of the biggest, most important ghettos, just because it was very hard to find. There was one diary from this place and one diary from that place, and it was hard to really bring them together into cohesive whole because the experiences were so different. But these were 3 places where I could have groups and compare just amongst them in a really serious way. And I'll talk about a little bit about how these diaries survived, because you can see even from these pictures on my slide, it wasn't a foregone conclusion. All the people that wrote diaries, almost every single one of them, did not survive the Holocaust. Out of the 30 to 40 that I look at, and it depends on how you define the genre, we could talk about that if you want. Out of these diaries, only 3 of the people who wrote them survived. So it wasn't, it wasn't that easy to rescue one's writing. If at some point in the writing, all of these diarists realized that they probably weren't going to make it. And so they took various steps to attempt to maintain, to save their writings, at least for posterity. But again, it wasn't usually possible. So we don't know how many, probably hundreds of diaries that were written at the time. But what we have is kind of a small surviving remnant of what had been written. And so these diaries that do still exist in the archives ranged from just short snippets, because most of it was lost, to more complete diaries, 200-300 pages, where people wrote every single day for years and years on end. And so I have here these images, and they are from the diary of somebody named Emanuel Ringelblum. And I will talk about him more in a moment. He was a historian in the Warsaw Ghetto who created an underground archival project. And that's how his diary and many other, actually all of the Yiddish diaries that survived from Warsaw were saved by this particular group of people that worked on this archive. And then they buried their archive, the whole thing, underground in the spring of 1943 when it's another long story, but there was a ghetto uprising against the German forces when they tried to deport everybody who was left to the death camps, and they fought for a month. They actually held the Nazis off for a month before they were, defeated and the entire ghetto was destroyed. But before that happened, they knew that this was coming, and so they decided to bury the documents at that moment. And then after the war, there were again 3 survivors, only one of whom is one of my diarists. 2 others, his wife and another woman who wrote a Polish diary, survived and kind of knew where these had been hidden. It was hard to find them because Warsaw had been completely destroyed. There were no streets left, there were no buildings left. So to try to figure out where the things had been buried was a struggle. 2 of the groups of documents were found, one was not. There's a rumor that it's under the Chinese embassy. I don't know if that's true or not. Presumably people have looked many times but not found those documents. Anyway, these were all dug up in the 50s. So it was already some period of time after the war ended before these were dug up. And you can see the state of them is really mixed, right? Some have undergone water damage, fire damage. The ghetto was literally razed by fire. You have some that were typed. This is all the same diarist, when he had access to a typewriter. Others are handwritten, kind of scribbled on paper. Some of the diaries are written, one's written that I use is written in an old date book. And one, there's a famous one that's written in the margins of a book. It was hard sometimes to find even just the paper and the pencil and everything in the terrible living conditions in the ghettos where people were not given enough food. There was no access to good hygiene. There was no access to medicine, and people were dying by the thousands every month in the larger ghettos. So this is kind of what it looked like after, and these are digitized copies. And I can tell you the whole other story about, from a source being rescued from the Holocaust to ending up in an archive and then me finding it is kind of another whole story. So this is what I had access to, for example, from Ringelblum's diary. All right, so how did I approach these diaries? Again, this gets back to how I started the talk, which is by using emotions and empathy. So I realized very early that emotions were the key to understanding how victims identified and made sense of perpetrators. It might seem clear that when I say perpetrators, I mean Nazis, and that is absolutely correct, right? The Nazis are the quintessential perpetrators. They are the people that, created the idea for the final solution and by and large carried it out. However, as we also know, there were all kinds of other people around all the time, all of whom had some role to play. And so I'm talking about local people, Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, who participated in the persecution of Jews, either through theft or through participating police forces that guarded the ghetto or helped round Jews up, all the way to actually committing murders. In Lithuania, for example, the murder of the Jews of Vilna took place almost completely at the hands of a group of 200 Lithuanians. It wasn't, the Nazis organized it, but the actual murders took place at the hands of these Lithuanians. So there were different people involved. And then within the Jewish communities themselves, within the ghettos, the Nazis had created Jewish structures. They had created the Jewish councils, who were kind of the authoritative body in charge of the day-to-day running of the ghettos, and the Jewish police, which was a police force that was tasked with carrying out law and order, making sure people didn't resist, making sure people didn't, break any of the Nazi laws, within the ghettos. And those people also eventually had to participate in the deportation of other Jews to the killing centers. And so there were all kinds of people around doing all kinds of things. And what I realized very quickly is that when I was reading and I was seeing, I was looking for when do they talk about perpetrators? And what I found was that every time they talk about perpetrators, there's a lot of emotions involved. And when I look at those emotions and also what they're describing, it's all these people. It's in no way just Nazis. And so I really had to understand how they felt. I had to understand how complicated the situation was for them. And again, not to blame Jews for, participating, but rather to understand how the regular ghetto inhabitants were thinking about the Jews, not my judgment, their judgment, and trying to understand what that did to their understanding of their worlds. Again, all of this to understand how they felt before the final solution, right? There were these very rich lives that they, endured for years before the eventual murder. And then secondly, I came across, and this was actually quite late. This was in the book about historical empathy in at all, and especially in Holocaust studies, was published in 2020. And before that, really nobody had even conceptualized this in terms of history. Like I said, historians by and large are much more kind of objective group that like to take a step back and try to understand historical, tell historical stories based on the sources they find, rather than finding the sources and trying to figure out what the sources are telling us. And that's what the use of historical empathy as a methodology is. So one of the things I was using, because I was looking at emotions and it was just so clear, the fear, the anger, the hostility, the blame, the judgment, the feelings of betrayal, all of these are rife in the diaries when they talk about the variety of people that cause their suffering. So I used the history of emotions, which is a kind of historical way of thinking about emotions in society, how they function in society and what they mean. And that made a lot of sense to me as I was trying to understand, again, comparing different diaries and how they all talked about, for example, and my chapters give just all kinds of descriptive examples of what's happening. So for example, blaming the Jewish council members who they felt were exploiting the situation for their own good. They would call them, dirty, rotten scoundrels and the lowest of the low, and just use these descriptors that made it clear that it wasn't just like they did this one thing, but that there was something, actually wrong with them. And so you saw always this sense of betrayal, for example, when they were talking about people that they saw as persecutors, not perpetrators maybe, but persecutors who were Jewish. And when they talked about the Poles, for example, they very much used kind of the emotions of frustration, and that they were, continually robbing from them. And how could they do this? So kind of like surprise and frustration. And of course, when they talked about the deportations, it was anger and fear and just really very emotionally loaded language. And that's a term I use, loaded language. Like, when are they actually using descriptors that are more than just, oh, the Nazis did this and the Jewish council did this, but what does it mean when they're calling them names and when they're expressing their fear and disgust? Disgust is a big one, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. A quote in a minute. And then the empathic history. So it's like emotions and empathy. So in order to read the emotions, I used empathy. And this is a long quote from this book that I use. But basically what it's getting at, this historian and psychologist, Thomas Kohut, has defined the historical use of empathy as a way of knowing and understanding in history by imagining one's way, thinking one's way, feeling one's way inside the space of experience and horizon of expectation of past people. So that's what I'm trying to do in the book, right? Looking at trying to imagine how they actually felt through their words. And then he says, this is my words, my book seeks to understand these people through his words, occupying the internal or empathic observational position to view historical phenomena from the perspective of the people of the past, to understand, view and understand their world as they viewed and understood it. So that's what I'm trying to do with the empathy, and using emotions as kind of a way to alert me to where I need to pay attention. So I have here a couple slides on case studies. I'm going to skip through the first one. The second one I already spoke to you about, and this is the case of Emanuel Ringelblum, that historian in the Warsaw Ghetto, who had created the Oynig Shabbos archive, which is the largest archive to survive from any ghetto. It's thousands and thousands of documents that are just span the gamut of what existed in the ghetto. So we have a lot of personal diaries. We have reportage that they wrote on various subjects, smuggling in the ghetto or hiding in the ghetto, food in the ghetto, all kinds of things. There are interviews that they did with people in the suburbs that were brought into the ghetto for concentration to hear about their experiences outside. There, announcements, official announcements that would go out, money, just any ephemera from the moment, and they collected by the thousands, and as I said, buried it after in 1943 and found it after the war. And you have the figure of Emanuel Ringelblum, who organized this whole thing. There were about 30 contributors. And you see that he was in fact killed in 1944. So he is one of the dyers who did not survive. He was hiding, outside the ghetto. He was being cared for by a Polish family. And somehow, we don't know the answer still, the hideout was discovered. It was he and his wife and his child and 30 other people. And they were all taken back into the ghetto and shot in 1944. So his documents survived, but he did not. And we have here this picture of what it looked like when they were digging up the Oynig Shabbos. And this guy here is Hirschwasser, who was one of the survivors, and who also wrote a diary that I use in my book. And then here you have an image of what is tin milk cans and boxes that they thought would probably stand up to the elements better than anything else. And they did survive. They did save a lot, although as you saw, not the state of everything wasn't always great. So there's every story of survival for these documents, just like for the people, is kind of surprising and is a miracle on its own that anybody survived to go back and find this. And this guy, Hirschwasser, like I mentioned, he survived himself, right? The individual survival stories are also shocking. He was on a train to Treblinka. He was able to jump off and hide. And then he was found again in a hideout, and he and the other people in the hideout got in a shootout with the Nazis and managed to escape and survive the war. Like, it's unbelievable that he's alive, right? There's no reason that he should be alive and should have been able to go back and find these documents, but thank goodness he did.
I apologize for interrupting. Is it okay if we pause for questions around 5?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Oh yeah, 3 minutes. Yeah. So I'm just going to say a couple things because I've already given you the kind of general idea of what I was doing, why I did it, and some of the really important people that I found. But I came up with kind of 3 main findings. There are a lot of findings because it was just, it was really rich to look at thousands of pages of diaries and to think about the ways that emotion appeared in them. But what I found that, again, kind of speaks a little bit differently to the history of the ghettos, the way that historians typically write it, is that suffering in the ghettos was caused most of all by an onslaught of daily occurrences, not by the Holocaust, right? They didn't know there was going to be a Holocaust. They didn't know until summer or fall of 1942 that there was any kind of mass deportation planned for them. So there was all kinds of other things that they were going through on a day-to-day basis that caused most of their suffering. And that's what the book pulls out, all these other forms of suffering. The second one is that the emotional reactions to people that cause the suffering also often point toward less research persecutors, not just the Nazis or the Jewish councils and police who have been well researched, but all kinds of other people, Jews with social, economic, bureaucratic privilege, local Poles and Lithuanians, even if they weren't shooting. And that also kind of alongside all of these people, there was the ability for people to constantly move in and out of the categories. You could, for example, be a kind of vulnerable ghetto resident one day and the next day join one of the collaborationist groups in the ghetto. And then all of a sudden you become a collaborator. And then you could be murdered by the Nazis for being in that collaborative group, in which case then you're just really a victim again. So there were all kinds of ins and outs that people don't typically write about in histories of the ghettos. And then the last one, and I'll give you this quote to kind of end the talk, is that, again, I argue that diarists constantly wrote about, assessed, and evaluated and judged all of these people, right? And that this judgment of people that caused their suffering, again, of all kinds, from Nazis down to Jews, that this judgment was their way of trying to maintain their own humanity, and to make a claim that there was still a notion of humanity, and that sticking to that notion of humanity was a really important, was just important ethically, right? Even if it, even though they knew they wouldn't survive, that wasn't the point. The point was that in separating themselves and maintaining their own, pre-war ideas of morals and ethics and helping one another, that they were, holding on to something that they thought was really, really important, to be essentially human. And so I'll end with this quote. This is from Abraham Levin, who was one of the diarists in the Warsaw Ghetto, who also did not survive. It says, "We live in a prison. We have been degraded to the level of homeless and uncared for animals. When we look at the swollen, half-naked bodies of Jews lying in the streets, we feel as if we find ourselves at some subhuman level. Yet we wish to live on, to continue as free and creative men. This will be our test. If, under the thick layer of ashes, our life is not extinguished, this will prove a triumph of the human over the inhuman, and that our will to live is mightier than the will to destruction, that we are capable of overcoming all evil forces which attempt to engulf us." And I would argue, he's talking ostensibly about life, but he's also talking about what it means to be human, to not ignore the dead people lying in the streets, to be able to continue with morals, ethics, religious belief in the face of all of these forces that would seek to destroy them. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simon. I'd like to open up the floor now for questions. We only have a few minutes. We're going to end a little bit early today, around 6. Dr. Simon can get to another meeting, but if people would like to raise their hand or put a question in the chat, feel free to go ahead. I can start off with a question if no one else has one. I was wondering what your opinion is on kind of the rise in anti-Semitic sentiments we've been seeing lately, accompanied by a lot of kind of transphobic and homophobic sentiments that we're seeing kind of displayed across the news. And some people I've seen and kind of on other social media outlets have related that to like the beginnings of the Holocaust and the Nazi reign. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. What can I say? So we in the Serling Institute for Jewish Studies have been working very hard to combat anti-Semitism at MSU, because not only publicly has it been rising, but also within our campus, which is partly why we're having a forum on anti-Semitism at 6:30. So we've been doing a lot of educational programming. We also wrote a guide to anti-Semitism to help educate, kind of assuming that most people just don't know a lot about Jews, don't know a lot about the history of Jewish persecution. Probably all they know is about the Holocaust, and not about, I teach a whole class, Jews and anti-Semitism, where we start at the Bible and we go to today. And there's, I have to cut out the vast majority of history because we just don't have time. So there's that. So we are aware of and have been fighting against anti-Semitism on our campus. We also, I'm thinking when you say the transphobic and the anti-Semitism, I'm thinking about like the comments from Kanye West last year, where he's also said, trans and homophobic things, and also was basically said he was going to go DEFCON 3 on the Jews, and all kinds of negative stereotypes about Jews that was really resonant because he has 100 million followers. So there were a lot of people being exposed to this anti-Semitism and hatred of the Jewish people. So, I mean, I can't say that I would say this is like some kind of precursor to the Holocaust. But it is true that where there is kind of endemic anti-Semitism, there is often, it is a signal that society is not functioning well, that democracy is not functioning well. So I'm not going to say that we're going to move to a Holocaust by any stretch of the imagination, but the fact that this kind of rhetoric is now, again, so public. I mean, it's always been private. Anti-Semitism has always been there. But the fact that it's kind of allowed to be voiced publicly by officials. I actually responded this week. I was on the news last Thursday, responding to Republican GOP Michigan GOP party tweet that had a bunch of rings from that had been confiscated from Jews at Treblinka. And it said, before they took away these rings, they took away the guns. And so the tweet was in opposition to the gun legislation that went through. But using the Holocaust, again, that's not how it worked. The Nazis didn't say, we're taking your guns and next we're going to kill you. So I don't think that we can really pull those kinds of arguments out, but we can be concerned about the fact that these kinds of things are so accepted and more. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. We have a question from someone else. They ask, were there ghettos in Europe before the Nazis invaded?
No. So there's a long history of the term ghettos, and the term ghettos actually was from the 1500s in Venice. When that was the first ghetto, and the term ghetto from the Italian was denoted a Jewish living area in Venice, in which Jews were required to live. The difference was, so the idea then, it was a religious anti-Semitism, and the idea was that Jews were dangerous to Christians, that they would try to get them, they would try to convert them, or perhaps there was a notion of the blood libel. Perhaps they would kidnap their children and kill them and use their blood for ritual purposes, or all of these kind of outlandish ideas about who Jews were and what they did. And so they were, forced to live in a ghetto, but the ghetto was not closed like the Warsaw Ghetto. People went in and out all the time. They lived their lives. It was just where they lived. And then where they were locked in at night. But otherwise they lived their lives. So it wasn't meant to be punitive. It was meant to be, safety measure. That existed throughout the Middle Ages in a number of cities in Europe, but not in the modern period, right? Those were gone by the time the modern period came around. So certainly by the end of the 1700s, there were discussions all around Europe, and by the late 1800s, Jews everywhere could live wherever they wanted. They could participate fully in economic life, in public life, in Central and Western Europe. The Russian Empire is different, but so in Western and Central Europe, they were pretty well assimilated, and there wasn't any kind of ghetto system that was ongoing.
All right. And then another question here from Sharmila. Given such sensitive and heartbreaking content, what challenges did you face when creating the methodology and going through your findings objectively?
Yeah, it was really hard. You could read my book and debate whether you think I'm subjective or not. I mean, basically, I was just trying to, the way that I was subjective was being able to kind of figure out ways of categorizing what I found. Because again, you read thousands of pages. Most pages don't say anything about perpetrators. I went to work and this happened and that happened, or, daily life, it's not all about perpetrators. So the work itself was quite strenuous in that way, but also emotionally draining because, again, like I think you point out, it's emotionally draining. You're reading somebody's intimate writings and they die at the end, and it's very difficult to to engage with that. So I can't say that I was always separated, but at least when it came down to writing my findings, I was always looking for, yes, how can I as the historian kind of categorize and organize what I'm thinking, right? What are the ways or that they're saying, right? They're saying this, and the way they say it is a jumble too. It's their life is a jumble. And so I saw it as my job to kind of try to make some sense of what they were doing. So like I said, I have one chapter that presents a different categorization of perpetrators based on how they talked about them. I have another chapter that looks at the different terminology that they use to talk about them. So it's easy to kind of group things together and then figure out, what I thought that meant.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more questions if anybody has any. Are there any at the People's Church over there? All right, well, if not, we have one from our own Dr. Waller. He asks, were many of the diaries written with an expectation that they would one day be found, or were they more commonly written as a catharsis?
Yeah, really both. A lot of the diaries that I use were more of the first version, and this is a big part of the introduction to my book, like thinking about diaries as a genre and kind of what it means, because it kind of means something different if it's a catharsis and it's like really meant to be just a personal, accounting versus with an eye to, audience and eventually to post-war audiences. I do argue, in fact, I have argued in other things I've written that even for these diarists who do look kind of outward more, they can't help but kind of release their emotions, right? Even if they're trying to remain objective, like Ringelblum. And many of them, even though they had an audience in mind, they were doing both, right? They were also, I'm thinking about Levin. He was a teacher at a religious school, and he was part of the, organizing the Oinig Shabbos. So he was clearly aware of the fact that people, would likely read his diary after the war, but he writes it very intimately, very emotionally. And so you feel like it's got to be serving both purposes for him. But I'll give you a quote. There's another example that I didn't give that was one of my case studies, Herman Crook, who was a diarist in the Vilna ghetto, who also did not survive. And I'll give you two quotes. One is right at the beginning. He knew it was going to happen. He had escaped from Warsaw to Vilna in 1939, and Vilna didn't get into the war until the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. So he knew what was going on in Warsaw. He had friends and family there, but he was, away from it until summer 41. So summer 41 comes around and he's writing and he says this quote, "I make a firm decision. I leave myself to the mercy of God. I'm staying, and right away I make another decision. If I'm staying anyway, and if I'm going to be a victim of fascism, I shall take pen in hand and write a chronicle of a city. My chronicle must see, must hear, and must become the mirror and the conscience of the great catastrophe and of the hard times. I have decided to write a chronicle of the events of Vilna." So he sees his, diary because it's daily, but he sees it much more as a chronicle. But again, he can't help but kind of cry out at different points in time in a way that you wouldn't do in a regular chronicle. And I'll give you this last example. And this is from September of 41, when there were the shootings. So in Vilna, most of the people were shot outside of the city before the ghetto, or kind of contemporary with the ghetto being created. So at the start of the war, there were 70,000 Jews in Vilna. And by the time the ghetto is created, by the end of December, there's only 15,000 Jews left to actually go into the ghetto. So it's a different situation. And when Crook first hears about this, basically, it's a whole disgusting story, but these women, there are 6 women who survived this mass shooting and come back to the ghetto injured, and they give their testimony of what they experienced. And he writes it down. He interviews them and he writes it down. And in response to writing that down, he says this quote, "I don't know if I will ever live to see these lines, but if anyone anywhere comes upon them, I want him to know this is my last wish. Let the word someday reach the living world and let people know about it from eyewitness accounts." So he's very clearly, first he's emotional because he's, if anybody ever sees this, please, this is my last wish. And that, he's clearly writing for us so that we should know what happened. So yeah, the short story is it's a mix, but there's a few examples of somebody who was very clearly with his eye outward.
Very good. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there just so we can give you time to get to your next meeting. But thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and I appreciate seeing you again. So yeah, and thank you everyone else for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.